Human spaceflight is often accredited as a testament to American exceptionalism. And while we are currently the only nation that has successfully landed humans on the moon, it would be wrong to say that the story starts with us. Another nation that had a massive space program was the Soviet Union, and for a while they were the unmatched champions in aeronautics. The past of the Soviet space program has mostly been forgotten about, kind of swept under the carpet, which is unfortunate because it is an incredibly interesting story. So today, we're going to talk about the Soviet space program. In the turn of the 20th century, while Western nations were developing flight machines, the Russians were studying rocketry. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky developed many of the early mathematical models and theoretical ideas for spaceflight, and provided a lot of the first concepts that we would actually use when we went to space, like the multi-stage rocket. The Russian Empire was also the birthplace of many ideas that NASA would end up using when putting people on the moon. One of those was the rendezvous maneuver, where when going to the moon, a capsule would orbit the moon and a lunar module would go down separately and land on the moon. When the lunar module was ready to come back to Earth, they would launch up into orbit from their lunar module and then meet up, rendezvous with that lunar capsule that was in orbit. And then both of them would reconnect and fly back to Earth. That is a staple of the Apollo program, and it's likely to also be a staple of the Artemis program. So it's really interesting to know where that idea came from, because we've been using it for every single lunar mission since the beginning of the space race. Also made in Russia were the first rocket engines, both liquid, where the fuel and oxidizers are simply gases that are compressed really hard into liquids, and then those are burned together to create the reaction that would propel the rocket and give it thrust. They also were the first to make solid rockets, where the main fuel for the rocket was a volatile powder or paste that would be burned just like the liquid rocket material. Many experiments were run by the Russians, and they developed a lot of the initial science for rocketry that became essentially common knowledge or necessary knowledge for the NASA program. They were the first to explore and understand the basic ideas of spaceflight. Today, we Americans like to look at communism in a dim light, saying that it makes a nation inferior in Stone Age, and in many ways, there's certainly an argument for that. But Russia itself had phenomenal scientists, and they contributed a tremendous amount of innovations that no other country has ever made. The Soviet Union itself had no shortage of brilliance and geniuses. They were engineering marvels, essentially. This was one of the main reasons that we were able to get to the moon so quickly, is because we felt like we were really outpaced by those Russians. We were almost intimidated by their genius, by how inventive they were. For this reason, it was no surprise when the Soviets sent up the first artificial satellite in human history, the famous Sputnik 1 in 1957. This was very shortly after the Soviets had sent the first intercontinental ballistic missile, the ICBM, which is a missile that works on the principle of exiting the atmosphere. Even still, in the same year, the Soviets also made history by sending up the first animal into space. It was a stray dog from the streets of Moscow named Laika. She had been put on a spacecraft and successfully sent into space. Safely. She survived the journey and she got to space. Sadly, she died halfway through the flight due to hypothermia. The Soviets were still able to get an animal, a living animal, and send it up to space and have it survive, which proves that animals can survive space flight, exiting the atmosphere and then entering orbit. The Soviets were able to do many of the following that I'm about to list off right now. First, rocket ignition in space. First spacecraft to escape the gravity of Earth. First space to Earth and Earth to space communication. First spacecraft to reach the moon. First to take pictures of the far side of the moon. First spacecraft to send animals to orbit and back, dogs Belka and Strelka. First woman in space, first man in space, first probe to reach Mars, first spacecraft into lunar orbits, first lunar robots, first probe to reach Venus. The Soviets were notable challengers in the space race. Their technology, their science, their invention allowed them to carry themselves very far and developed a very, very far early lead in the space race. They broke many records and accomplished many challenges, but it wasn't all that good. Spaceflight, or any flight at all, is wrought with challenges and danger. During the height of the space race in the 50s and the 60s, that was especially true. Many pioneers unfortunately lost their lives trying to extend the boundary of human presence. Many of the first people who were on the frontier of where we've gone did not survive, unfortunately. Even after the space race was over, we still lost many people traveling to space in places like the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster. However, the Soviets were a little notorious for having quite a few more casualties than the Americans. Needless to say, being a cosmonaut was dangerous. To clarify, American space travelers are referred to as astronauts, from the word astro, meaning space. It's Latin or something, I don't know. Soviet space travelers, and even Russian space travelers today, are typically referred to as cosmonauts. Cosmo coming from the term cosmos, which means outer space. In this video, when we talk about cosmonauts, we're talking about space race era Soviet space travelers. Cosmonauts in particular faced a unique set of challenges and dangers. They were under a lot of pressure to meet deadlines and beat records. And for this reason, many things were rushed, and spacecraft failures were tremendously more common. This period of Russian spaceflight proved to have a lot of very unfortunate deaths and incidents. As of 2025, and hopefully far after 2025, a total of 3 people have died in space, meaning that at the time of their deaths, they were at an altitude greater than 100 kilometers. This particular incident happened in 1971 aboard the Soyuz 11. The Soyuz 11, which was docked at the first Soviet space station, Salyut 1, this space mission, which had its own capsule, its own module, was attempting to leave the space station and return back to Earth. While it escaped and detached from the Soviet space station, what unfortunately happened was a rapid decompressurization, which is a fancy term for having all the air inside of a space capsule rush out. This violent movement was enough to kill all 3 cosmonauts aboard. The men on board were named Grigory Dubrovsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Petseyev. All 3 men lost their lives, unfortunately. It is believed that the Soyuz 11 disaster was due to an engineering error, where a depressurization valve was opened when it was not supposed to be. This tragic event is one of the primary reasons that when you see today's space travelers go into space or come back for re-entry, they will always be wearing spacesuits, because inside of a spacesuit, they are protected in case of any event of rapid decompressurization. They have their own isolated air system, and it provides an extra safeguard should any sort of depressurization occur while they are in liftoff or in re-entry. Other events have sadly occurred in the Cosmonaut space program. One of the more tragic examples was one of the Soyuz 1 mission, piloted by cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. The Soviet Union rushed the launch of this mission so that it could coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, but it was rushed far too much. It was well known by all engineers that this spacecraft was doomed. It was meant to fail, and in its current status would not possibly survive. But due to the challenging political climate of the Soviet Union at the time, there really was no option to speak out against any sort of engineering problems. No engineers could possibly go against the Central Committee. Komarov was very much well aware of the dangers that he was about to face. He was essentially guaranteed to die on his mission. But he was very certain about wanting to proceed. He absolutely wanted to go on that mission, primarily 100% because his backup pilot, his backup cosmonaut, was his best friend, another Soviet hero of space travel, Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin at that mission was his backup pilot. So if Komarov had backed out, it was essentially a death sentence for Yuri Gagarin. Not wanting to put his best friend in such a dangerous position, Komarov went himself. He knew that he would die in this capsule, but it was a willing sacrifice to save his best friend. Komarov reportedly cried in rage as he came into... His death occurred when his spacecraft crashed into the Earth at over 90 miles per hour. The Soviets have had their ups and downs. But when considering the contributions that they have made to science and to our knowledge of even our own solar system, one has to admit that there is a lot to be said about their accomplishments. The Soviets were the first to provide us with images of the far side of the moon. Before that, no human had ever seen the distant far side of the moon before. They captured the first successful close-ups of Mars and Venus. They were the first ones to send out space probes to capture images of them. And to date, the Soviets currently are the only ones to have successfully put a space probe on the surface of Venus, which is the hottest planet on our solar system. While it was on there, it transmitted pictures back to us. And to date, like I said, to date, these are the only pictures we ever have. These are the only pictures we have ever taken of the surface of Venus. Mind you, the surface of Venus is like 200 degrees Celsius, and it's incredibly pressurized due to all the CO2 and the heavy atmosphere that's just crushing the surface. Nobody has ever successfully done this before. No one has ever successfully even recreated it. Soviet spacecraft have also collected and transmitted back data on a lot of asteroids and comets in our solar system. As scientists and engineers today look on forward to the future of space travel and what it means for humanity, it would be worthwhile for them to just take a peek backwards and look at the Soviets. When it comes to the Soviet science during the space race, there is a very interesting story to tell. This has been Davey Science, and thanks for watching.